first day was kind of introducing science in general, and then we did talk about experimental design in the theme of biology because we were talking about spontaneous generation. But today we really are introducing the topic of biology like for real. So what is biology? Like, what is its definition?
Study of life.
Right. So it's the study of life, which is extremely vague. There's a million different ways you can do that. And so we will cover all kinds of different things. So it's the study of life, the living world. You can put that a few different ways. So I argue that today, in today's society or culture or whatever, however you want to say it, to me, I think biology is the most important science. Why would you argue that biology is more important than physics, for example?
Because basically, biology is like life and how things survive and stuff, and that's what we need to know.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to survive, man, right? So it affects us more intimately and directly than anything else. I mean, medicine and food, growing food and fortifying food with nutrition and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, really, when you think about we're trying to maximize our state of well-being. Yes, technology does that for us, but really being healthy and being alive, I mean, if you don't have those things, we're not sitting here inventing computers either. So we have to take care of those needs. Now, historically, I would say like in the past, biology probably wasn't the most important science. I would say for the last like 150 years, it has been. But let's say it's like, let's go like way back like a 1,000 years, well, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, doesn't really matter. What would be like the most important like study of the natural world that people did? I usually argue that like that long ago, probably astronomy was the most important science because the way we kept track of time, both like calendar-wise, what day of the year it is, what season is it, but also like literally what time of day it is. We did that by observing the sky. And we based our holidays and our rituals and all kinds of things around celestial events and things like that. So it was the most influential area of study, and that kind of leads to it was extremely important too. But there are all kinds of other things that people were up to way back in the day. So we're going to get into each of these, but life is really distinct on the planet. And life comes in all kinds of different forms, like the grass that's outside. Well, that's definitely alive. But it's kind of hard to like, you look at grass and you're like, well, what does it do? I mean, it grows, but is it really, it's hard to observe it really do anything. Now, when you look at an animal, it's really clear. I mean, animals, they move around, they have behavior. We can watch them capture food, reproduce, all of that kind of stuff. And a very long time ago, people that tried to study the natural world basically said there's two kinds of life. There's plants and there's animals. And that's it. So they thought that like funguses, mushrooms and whatnot, they thought those were plants. They kind of look like plants. You buy them in the produce section in the grocery store. Can you imagine if there was a fungus aisle in the store? I don't think people would be buying mushrooms anymore if like fungus was one of the aisles. It said produce and then fungus right next to it. That would be funny though. And they didn't know anything about germs. They didn't know anything about even like there are multicellular animals that you really can't see with the naked eye, or you can, but you can't tell what they are. They just look like dots, basically. So they looked at things much more simply. Now, if you take a blade of grass, a bacteria, some other kind of unicellular thing, a person, or that covers most of it, or a fungus, are there characteristics that all of those things, no matter how, despite how different they are there things, a core set of things that they all share in common? Are there, and what would they be?
Well, they're all part of something. Like animals are part of the food chain, so I guess they have that in common.
Sure. So they interact with each other at some level. That's something we'll talk about towards the end of the day today. There's like an interdependence between them.
All living things have to reproduce, and
Yes.
they are all made up of one or more cells.
Yes. So yeah, there are things that you and a blade of grass have in common. Not a lot. There doesn't have to be that many. And biologists have really come up with, it can vary depending on who you ask, but I believe what I present are 8 specific examples of, for something to be considered alive, it has to be all of these things. So again, despite the fact that life is so incredibly diverse on this planet, from the unicellular to the multicellular, from the very big to the very small, there are characteristics that all of us share. These are what they are, and we're going to go into all of them in some detail here. So the first primary thing is all living things are made of one or more cells. So what is a cell? Well, it's a collection of, cells are made of the atoms and molecules that are part of nature, but they do a very special thing. For one, a cell is separate from its environment, right? So when we think of could AI ever be considered alive? Well, right now, our definition of life has to do with the cell. So if AI was conscious and could have its own thoughts and things like that, it would be maybe one day we'll just redescribe what it means to be alive. But for right now, this is what we have for an explanation. So you have to be enclosed within the cell to be considered alive. And you die, take a unicellular organism and poke a hole in it, it's going to start to die very, very quickly because the chemistry within it just shuts down. Now, you're a living thing, but if we could take a cell out of your body, that cell is alive too, because that individual cell, I don't know if we would call that cell you. I don't think we could do that. That wouldn't exactly be accurate. But that cell still exhibits all of these characteristics we will talk about. And in fact, under the right conditions, that cell can exist indefinitely without you. And we actually do this. There are cells that are grown in labs called, one specific group are called HeLa cells, named after Henrietta Lacks, who they were taken from. But they're called immortal something line cells. And we grow them in petri dishes, and they came from a person, but they just keep reproducing on their own. For burn victims, we grow skin grafts, living skin tissue, inside of labs, and then those can be donated to people as well. So what's in that petri dish is life. I don't exactly know if we would give that life an identity. We can't say it's a person, and we can't say it's something else, but that's sort of the part of the fun about this class is just breaking down what the heck are we actually looking at here, because it can be confusing at times. And a really, really important thing to keep in mind in this class, or if you took a physiology class at the college, everything that you do, your cells do. Ultimately, what happens with the food you eat? Well, it's dissolved in your digestive system and absorbed into your bloodstream. Guess what percentage of your daily calories your brain requires? Your brain only makes up about 4% of your weight. But how much energy does it need? It's around 20%. That's our best number for it. So, I don't know about you guys, but this week when I've gone home, I have to take a nap for an hour. I just have to. I have not been exercising this muscle this much. And it doesn't seem like we're doing all that much, really, but think of all the little problem solving things you have to do, and all the planning for the future and scenarios you have to jump through just because we're getting started here. So it is energy intensive, but your brain requires about 20% of your calories. And how does it get them? Well, it's dissolved through the bloodstream, goes in there. The oxygen you breathe, That goes into your bloodstream, and ultimately it has to go into your cells. The carbon dioxide that you breathe out, where does that come from? Well, it comes from your cells. It comes out of them, goes into the blood, and we breathe it out. The moving around, like how am I moving? Well, it's activities that my cells themselves are doing. Even when you think, can you have any thoughts if you don't have a brain? Can something without a brain have a thought? Well, no. And so it's like even my imagination or whatever. Now there's tons of this that is like really mysterious that we don't know for sure, but it definitely requires the brain, and the brain is made of cells and all of that kind of stuff. Everything we do, our cells can also do, except for, I guess, talk. Unicellular life really dominates the planet, but this is a class mostly about multicellular life, usually about people, kind of, sort of. When we do evolution, we'll talk a lot about animals as well as people. But what multicellular organisms do is we have specialized cells and tissues. Now, what's sort of remarkable about that, well, I'll get to that in a second. So here are just some unicellular organisms, a paramecium, a stentor, an amoeba, and what's called a volvox. So these are everywhere on the planet, but we didn't know they existed until the 1600s. So this is tissue from a person. I don't know exactly what part of the body, but so we are multicellular. We're collections of tons of cells. And as a little hobby, I actually make microscope videos, and I have them on my channel. So this is the Graafian follicle, is actually like an ovary. So that is a human egg cell right there in the middle, surrounded by all that stuff. And then just to the right of it, there's another one. So that's an egg cell that's going to be ovulated, or would have been ovulated. It's not going to be because it's preserved on a microscope slide. But we're made of tissues, which are collections of similar cells. But tissues in one part of the body, here we can see like a CT scan of an entire person. The tissues in one part of the body are radically different from another part. We can see muscle tissue here, we can see nerve tissue, we can see bone tissue, and the digestive organs, and the liver, and skin, and fat tissue, all of that stuff. Now there's one thing that all of these cells have in common. Do you know what that would be?
DNA.
Yeah, they have the same DNA, except for your reproductive cells are different, and we will learn about why that is. But a cell in your brain and a cell in your heart look totally different, but they have the exact same DNA in them. So the remarkable thing going back is you start off as one cell. A sperm and an egg cell unite, and then that zygote cell is you. It's got your DNA in it, the same DNA that will be in all of your cells. But it's not a type of cell of any kind, and it takes a really long time. You have to get to be several hundred cells before any of them start to become one sort of cell or the other. And that transformative process is really a remarkable thing. It is something that we will cover and learn about in a little bit of detail in this class. So the next thing, reproduction. No organism just lives immortally and doesn't pass on its lineage. Some organisms die and never reproduce, but in general, the individual species, have members that do reproduce, and then that species carries on. So there's two kinds of reproduction. Sexual reproduction is when two cells fuse together. So animals do this with sperm and egg. Plants do this with pollen, and it's also called an egg. Some plants release spores. But then there are other animals that are capable of doing asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is just where a single individual produces an offspring. And that offspring, because it only came from one parent, is essentially a clone of that parent. And there's two different kinds of this. There's binary fission and budding. So we'll cover those just really briefly here. Bacteria and archaea do what's called binary fission. So the cell just literally splits itself into two pieces, and so there you go. That's how one bacteria becomes two, and then two become four, so on and so on. Animals, such as this is a hydra that you're seeing here, and you can see there's like an offspring, I guess you could call it, being budded off. It pinches off from the organism, and then it grows and matures into its own sort of thing. Can you think of any other animal that's capable of doing something like that? So starfish can do this. You maybe have heard this before. If you chop a starfish in half, eventually the starfish, like, it's possible that it dies, but it's very likely that each half will just grow into a brand new starfish. In fact, if you just break off one arm of a starfish, that single arm can grow into an entire starfish, for example. Sponges can have part of their body break off, and then it will just go on and recolonize, reconstitute itself. You can actually shred a sponge into a million little pieces, and it'll rearrange itself in kind of a creepy way. Now, those are organisms that are extremely simple. Evolutionarily speaking, they evolved an extremely long time ago, so their bodies are simple. This cannot be done with a horse or a bird or an animal like that. I think many species of worm can be like cut and they will go on living, but for the most part, it does not work that way. Animals have to reproduce sexually and not asexually. Next thing is all organisms have DNA inside of them and RNA. So DNA is really the master molecule. All of the functions that a cell can go through, and then therefore the organism can perform, is encoded at some level within that DNA. And so, sort of talked about this, organisms that reproduce sexually, their offspring are genetically different from their parent in certain ways, whereas asexually reproduced offspring are technically clones of their parent. And this is what DNA looks like, and we have an entire chapter on DNA and what DNA does and how it works. Growth and development. So like for a bacteria, it divides and then it just simply grows a little bit bigger. Bacteria don't really have features, at least not in the way we're used to thinking about them. The hydra simply just grows a little bit bigger. But for other, especially multicellular organisms, we go through a process of differentiation, which is, I've already talked about this, that's the process of one cell dividing into many, and then those many cells becoming different types of cells all throughout your body. Muscle, nerve tissue, blood, you name it. There are other organisms that go through a really radical transformation. So can you think of an animal that, not just the fact like from when it's fertilized to like when it's born or something like that, but throughout its life radically transforms in some way? Yeah, a frog, like a tadpole. A tadpole is not a fish. It's like a fish, but it lives completely in the water. And then frogs and toads, so it kind of varies. They'll be totally aquatic or semi-aquatic or not aquatic really at all. There are types of salamanders that when they are like babies, I don't know if that's the best word for it, but when they're young, they have gills, and then their gills disappear as they become adults and they start breathing air. What else?
Butterflies?
Yeah, butterflies. We're going to talk about butterflies very specifically here in a little bit, but they metamorphosize. They go from a caterpillar to a butterfly. So incredibly different, but it's the same animal. It's kind of weird that we give it a different name. You don't call, how do I want to say this? There's a specific name for the caterpillar and for the butterfly, but they're the same organism. So it's kind of weird that we do that, but that's what we figured out. So this is the differentiation process, your one cell. Eventually you become, the idea a really long time ago was you were just this microscopic, fully formed human, just too small to see. And then, you know those like pills with a sponge in it, and it's like the shape of a dinosaur. And you throw it in water, and it grows bigger. That's what we thought. That's what we thought people were like. Well, that's what we thought everything was probably like. You must just be a microscopic version of yourself, and you grow bigger. No, it turns out when we got the technology and we could see, you start off as a cell. Like you don't have, there's no body part whatsoever there. And gradually they develop. You have a tail that disappears at some point. Your arms and legs are just these like buds that have no fingers or toes, and eventually they develop. All of those things, they gradually come about. And that is an extremely interesting and radical transformation, and it is something we will learn about this year. So the butterfly, I just have one interesting, couple interesting things about butterflies. So when the caterpillar is in the cocoon or pupa or chrysalis, whatever you're supposed to call it, it's not just that its body turns into a butterfly, it sort of completely restarts as a collection of living material. The caterpillar, in a way, sort of dissolves. Its body completely becomes like a, I can't think of the word, but it just totally disincorporates. Like if you cut open a pupa while it was in the middle of metamorphosis, you could like pour the poor caterpillar out. So like its body structure has completely disappeared, and then it reassembles into the butterfly form. So like its brain and all of those things, like they basically disappear and then sort of come back. Now, what's been really fascinating that's been found out is you can train animals to respond to things. It's called conditioning. If you've taken a psychology class, you know about that. So they took some caterpillars and they wanted to know, will butterflies remember being a caterpillar in some way? So they took some caterpillars and they used like a really smelly compound. I think it was like some kind of rubbing alcohol, I believe. Alcohol evaporates really quickly, and so it smells a lot too. So they would drop that alcohol around the caterpillar, and then, pretty crudely, they would shock the thing. And so that trains the caterpillar to, when it smells that smell, be ready for an electric shock. And then eventually, they don't have to shock the caterpillar anymore. When it smells the smell, it avoids it. It will start to do that in the opposite direction of the smell. So the caterpillar's been trained for this extremely simple task. And then they let it metamorphosize into a butterfly, and they introduce the smell to the butterfly, and the butterfly exhibits the exact same behaviors. So they are able to remember that in a way, which is really fascinating because they undergo such a radically different kind of transformation than anything else. Moving on. So all living things require energy and use energy. So like, a rock or the soil or a river doesn't use energy. A river contains potential energy, but it doesn't gather resources. It doesn't use resources. It's just simply a thing, right? So without a constant supply of like oxygen and water and nutrients, our cells would die and eventually the organism would die. And you've heard the word metabolism, I'm sure, before. Most people think metabolism is like related to your digestion, or like describes your digestion, and like the way you're able to burn calories, your whatever. And that's part of it, but really metabolism is all of the chemistry that goes on in your body, which can be measured in different ways too. So all organisms universally use energy, but the way they obtain energy greatly varies. So plants, for example, basically sort of make their own energy. They borrow energy from the sun, and then they make food with it. Plants make carbohydrates, and then the plants they metabolize those carbohydrates. We can't do that, so we have to eat things. So we take advantage of plants, which create energy, or animals that ate plants, and we steal their energy. I'm way too hungry to look at that picture for any longer. In really extreme environments, the craziest kind of things happen. So at the bottom of the ocean, there are these things called hydrothermal vents. And basically they spew out just a really hot water, and mixed with it are chemicals like sulfur compounds, perhaps sulfur dioxide would be one of them, that are poisonous to pretty much any kind of living thing on the planet. But there are these very special types of single-celled organisms called archaea, and they can actually eat that stuff, or they absorb it. They break it apart, the atoms and molecules, and they rearrange it into new molecules that they can then eat. They make carbohydrates out of them. Now, they're unicellular and you can't see them unless you have a microscope. The stuff that you see around here, these are tube worms. So these tube worms, they eat those archaea. Now, when you look at the structure of it, that red part, to me, it kind of looks like a feather or two feathers. These organisms are filter feeders. They really just sit there and they just let the food come to them. You know, like a cheetah has to have muscles and bones and teeth and claws so it can run after and capture prey. These things just sit there and they absorb they absorb organisms from their environment and they eat them. You can also find like crabs and other like kinds of fishes that live around these things. We also, there are like caves which are completely cut off from the outside world, no sunlight or anything, so no photosynthesis or anything. And they're like these acid pools where if you spent 3 seconds in there, that's probably long enough to kill you. But there are like unicellular organisms and kinds of worms and kinds of tiny fishes that live inside there. In the movie Jurassic Park, the original one, I keep forgetting his name, the guy with the glasses, he's also in Independence Day. I always forget his name. In the movie, his name is Dr. Malcolm, and one of his famous quotes from the movie is, "Life finds a way." And because of something we'll talk about in a little bit here, life seems to find ways to exist in crazy, crazy places. Another thing that everything that's alive does is it responds to its environment. And this, I mean, there's a million ways this can happen, and you can see the examples there on the screen. But in any case, we refer to a stimulus. Plural would be stimuli, which is something that we respond to. So when it gets hot out, the temperature is the stimulus, and we have a response, which is to perspire, to sweat, to cool our bodies down. When it's cold, we shiver. When we're hungry, our body does certain things to motivate us to go look for food. When we're angry or embarrassed, a different physiological mechanism takes place, and maybe our faces get red and our heart beats faster, all these kinds of things. Really extreme examples of this include, it's like a bear will hibernate. And there are kinds of frogs that will bury themselves in mud, and most of their body can actually freeze completely for months at a time. And then they're able to just wake up from it, which is pretty extraordinary. But the most extreme example I know about this in the living world is, for multicellular life, is what's called the resurrection flower. So let's say you have a flower in your house and you don't water it for 10 years. It's dead, right? Like, it's definitely dead. Because it's not doing any of the things we talked about. It's not taking in nutrients or energy and resources from the environment. It's not responding to its environment. It's not metabolically active. It's literally just a collection of atoms and molecules sitting there, not doing anything. It's dead. The resurrection flower can be left alone like this. If you picked it up and like squeezed it, one that looks like this, it would just crunch into pieces. And you probably, like when leaves die, it's just like that. Virtually all of the water is gone from it. We call that desiccation. And it's not photosynthesizing. It's not, in all practical purposes, it's dead. You can leave it alone for like 10 years if you want to. But you place it in water and it wakes up again. It absorbs the water, turns green, and begins photosynthesizing. So there's, what are we supposed to think about this? Was it dead and then it came back to life? Or was it never dead even though it failed to meet any of the requirements for life. I don't know which of those is the answer, and I don't know which of those is the weirder explanation either, but it's kind of fun to think about. Because of the living thing is organized around the cell, and the cell is separate from its environment, maintaining internal balance is absolutely crucial. You cannot hope to exist if you are full of holes, for example. And this is called homeostasis. And again, if you take a class like on physiology, it's all about homeostasis. Medicine is literally just homeostasis. I have these symptoms. Take this pill and it'll make those symptoms go away. I have this infection. Take these pills and it'll clear the infection out of your system. Whatever. It's all about bringing back homeostasis. Maybe you have to have an organ from your body removed so that you can maintain homeostasis. That happens from time to time. So there are internal stimuli that help our body maintain homeostasis. If you get a cut, there are internal mechanisms that work to clot your blood. When your body temperature gets too hot, there are internal mechanisms that help you out with that, plus a million other things. And hunger and thirst are examples too. And I think this is the last one. So evolution, our definition of life is that life changes over time. It evolves. So although the individual organism is basically extremely similar from its parent, it's the same species or whatever, over millions of years, and really billions of years in the case of life on Earth, those changes become so drastic that they produce brand new species. We'll spend like 2 months covering the topic of evolution because it's just such a huge topic. But the adaptations around evolution are how organisms have come to live in the bottom of the sea, in the soil, on dry land, and in those acid pools, as we have talked about. As an example, this is it's Death Valley. It's the hottest place in the world. It's really it's called Death Valley, so it seems like the antithesis of life. But every like 10 years or however often it rains, this is also a picture of Death Valley. So there are seeds in the ground from flowers that bloomed decades ago, perhaps. They drop those seeds, and those seeds are just waiting for a little bit of moisture to come their way, and then they're able to bloom and sprout. And so that's just one example of quite a lot. Now, to wrap it up here, biology, as sort of we said in the beginning, it's not like one area of study, because if you talk to a biologist, they do something very specific. They work on in all kinds of different levels. So for example, a biologist might just study atoms and molecules. You could be a biochemist. They don't necessarily interact with and study living things. They interact with and study the chemicals that make life. Somebody who develops medicine, for example, does this, because we don't really use living things as medicine, although we do. I mean, we kind of do, because we use leeches and maggots and things to treat people from time to time. But that's an example of biology, and we will do that starting next week. We will be studying atoms and molecules for a while. There are some biologists that only study individual cells, which is a huge part of this class. Is we're just talking about the individual cell. Tissues and organs, I mean, if you're a doctor, you kind of specialize in these kinds of things. But then there are biologists who only study one kind of organism. Maybe they only study like bacteria, and so like diseases associated with that. Or maybe like Jane Goodall studied chimpanzees, and that was really it. Or maybe you study livestock for some reason. I don't have this example up here, but there are biologists who all they do is they study viruses. Now, viruses aren't alive. They do contain DNA. Viruses evolve, they change. What are the things that viruses can't do that disqualify them from being a living thing?
dependent on living things?
Yeah, so a virus, they reproduce, but they force other living things to reproduce for them. So they're dependent on living organisms in that way. Viruses also, they don't have metabolism. They don't eat anything. A virus is sort of like a robot. It has DNA or RNA inside of it, and then it has a shell made of like proteins and stuff, but it doesn't consume anything. And so it doesn't really respond to its environment either, but it shares a lot of things in common with life, and it interacts with life, but it's not considered a living thing. Then a biologist maybe studies populations, like groups of animals. That would be something maybe an ecologist does, or an ecologist would probably focus more on the community and the ecosystem, which is all of the living and non-living things when you get to ecosystem in an environment. So how do living things interact with and influence the water they drink and the air they breathe and the soil they live on, and those kinds of things. And then there's also, technically you can look at the entire planet as a single living system at some level. Not exactly something we will focus on in this class, but it is out there. It's one of the levels of organization.